to the Thoughtful Software Podcast with your hosts, Andrew Wolf and Fahad Shokat. Thoughtful Software is a set of values, principles, and techniques to fuel digital innovation. We want to help usher in a new approach to the way software is imagined, designed, and built. This episode is all about storytelling and data. By itself, data is just numbers. However, if presented as a story, the impact is far-reaching on how it shapes the content we consume. To become a visionary technology leader, storytelling is key to bring clarity into a noisy world. We are speaking with storytelling expert Dr. Trauth Taylor of Untold Content. Dr. Taylor founded Untold Content as a writing consultancy devoted to empowering thought-leading organizations in communication and storytelling. Dr. Taylor and her team at Untold have crafted content strategies for several national initiatives, including the VA National Homeless Programs Office, VA Women's Health Program Office, the Medication Reconciliation Initiative, and the Millennium Challenge Corporation's Global Evaluation Brief effort. We loved this timely conversation and think that you will too. Here's Andrew, Fahad, and Katie.
All right, so let's talk about data, Katie. Data itself is boring. However, if we present it well, it can bring ideas to life and move projects forward. So episode is really all about storytelling and, bringing technology to life and bringing data to life. Maybe we can get started if you can tell us a little bit about yourself and your company.
Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. And I'm thrilled to talk about data storytelling and the ways that we try to communicate our technological innovations. I'm just thrilled to be able to jive with the two of you about those topics. I'm Trauth Taylor, and I'm CEO of Untold Content. We are an innovation storytelling firm. And so we support thought-leading organizations and helping them communicate their insights internally and externally. And so that looks like us supporting peer-reviewed publications and thought pieces, journal articles, infographics and design publications and deliverables to help them communicate technical, scientific, medical, and social innovations in a way that resonates with people and moves them to action.
So why is storytelling so important when it comes to technology?
So I think that perhaps in the earliest days of tech innovation, we would get so enamored and excited about new features and potentials and the actual functionality of the technology itself. And the ones that actually rose to prominence are the ones that actually had the end user in mind. And so over time, we came through this, shift into UX and design thinking and putting the consumer and the user front and center when it comes to any kind of tech innovation. And when you're thinking about humans, we are just wired for story. At Untold, we are keenly aware that the phrase or the word storytelling can feel very fluffy to people, especially coders or engineers or innovators. And subject matter experts can sort of say, oh, storytelling, that seems, just sort of like the fluff. Why should that matter to the really important and serious work that we're doing as technicians and technologists? And what we've found in our work at Untold, it sort of collaborating and working alongside these subject matter experts is the ones who can effectively look up from their screen or their lab bench or their patient bedside and say, here's why what I'm doing matters, and translate that work for people in other disciplines or for other stakeholders. Those are the ones that seem to just rise to prominence so much faster. And so storytelling is critical to us as humans. Technology should never be made outside of human need and importance and use and application. So here we are.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely fascinating because I spoke to my uncle. He's a professor at ASU, and he was telling me something very interesting. He said that if a lot of researchers who write grants, if they did more of a storytelling and explaining the idea, and rather than just data, there'd be a lot more grants that would be granted to these researchers. And I just found that so interesting that it wasn't necessarily the information, it was just how it was presented.
It's really interesting too, because when I started out as an engineer, I thought sales was the easiest thing on the planet. And I'm like, anyone could sell anything. I'm an engineer and I'm building valuable things. And who needs to sell things? And then as I became an architect and a CTO and all of that, I realized as I progressed up in my career, anything past a basic level job becomes a sales job. And sales is storytelling and it's narrative building. And how is your thing that you're selling going to help this person? And I think it's easy to devalue the thing that you don't participate in, right? Like, oh, the marketing people, their job's easy, my job's really hard, till you go and have to actually market something, and then it's really difficult. And so I 100% agree with you that last scientist said that they balk at storytelling, but I think to Fahad's point, if everyone was better at it, if they could build these impressive narratives and drive people to action, like the innovations would not only get better funded, but I think they get much more adoption, you know? And you can see it with like the vaccines happening right now. Everyone, like 50% of people don't want to take a vaccine. And I think, you hear Dr. Fauci saying, well, if you rush to get approval, people will be less likely to accept it. It'll feel like it was irresponsibly handled. And so in that case, this is a life or death situation, and they're taking their time to build this narrative of having ex-presidents go on TV and nationally broadcast their vaccine taking and things like that to build this narrative that it is safe, that this did go through scientific rigor, that this is something you should take. And if we didn't think like that, if we just rushed it, I mean, it could have disastrous results that cause this pandemic to last even longer than it's already lasted.
Absolutely. There's a story that what both of you said, I was just reminded of. We were doing a case analysis of a company called Color Genomics, and they do genetic testing, and now they also do COVID-19 testing. They particularly try to sell to employers and have those employers provide genetic testing to their employees as part of their health benefits. Well, the CEO of Color was sitting next to the CEO of the Levi Strauss company on an airplane. And he didn't show him data points. He didn't show him a fancy slide deck. All he did was say, we founded Color Genomics because of my mom's personal story with breast cancer, and how that inspired us to essentially, I believe they created the first BRCA genetic testing innovation and then scaled it. And through that one conversation, that one story of personal relevance and impact, Levi signed on as a customer of Color Genomics. And so I think that that's just one of so many examples that bring to light how, yes, data is critical. And I'm sure that they had deeper conversations with all the correct stakeholders after that to look into the data. But it was the story that opened that door and allowed the conversation to even happen in the first place.
So I have a few questions on that then. I worked at Tableau a little bit, and storytelling was one of the things that they beat into all of our heads. So you're convinced that, you have to tell stories with data. And obviously, well-formed graphs. This is a two-part question. I'll have to ask the one about this afterwards. But, putting the data in the right graph in the right form can be transformative. And you can look up examples of people using a bar graph incorrectly or a line graph incorrectly. How much do you think that contributes to it? Bad stories or good stories told poorly, I guess would be a better way of saying it. Does it, graphs are one way to tell, I guess, a story with data. So this is the second part. What other tools are available to people to tell these rich stories that aren't just graph visualization or tables? Those, are important and critical, but it doesn't seem like the only way either.
Yeah, I think the first thing that comes to my mind is how important the phrase flatten the curve has been to us in 2021 as a worldwide. The content of that phrase and the visual that goes alongside it, which is pretty simple to understand, right? If you practice social distancing and mask wearing and some of these, public health imperatives, then we'll be able to slow the rate of infection and make sure that ICUs don't get overwhelmed. And that's you're taking an individual, you have an individual and a societal responsibility to help flatten that curve. And the fact that as humans, we're really good at looking at lines and showing up and down comparison contrast and be able to see how that makes an impact. Our brains get that, and our brains also understand flatten the curve as a simple phrase that we can just sort of instill into our minds and repeat. And so you think of something that's actually pretty complex, which is asking the everyday person to do all of these things in order to try to help slow the impact to the health system, and you simplify it. So I think there are so many different tools available for data storytelling. Untold actually has a data storytelling training that we created originally for a children's hospital, actually. They were sitting on lots of data about pediatric heart failure, and they wondered, which of this data should we share with our providers and our nurses? And which of this data can we share with parents? And which can we actually share with kids? And what are the different formats and styles we should use to communicate with these different audiences? All of this really important data that's really going to help them make life or death decisions around their children's health. And so anyway, through that training experience, we essentially help clinicians or engineers or scientists or innovation teams think about all the options that are available when it comes to data storytelling. So obviously you're already familiar with Tableau, but data visualization, there are many different types of formats and styles and templates to use. But one of the things that we found really interesting when we were building and designing this training is there was a study done at New York University where they tried to understand, can an infographic elicit empathy? Can someone sort of put themselves in someone else's shoes by looking at an infographic and a data visual? And are there certain visualization techniques you can use to kind of turn the volume up or down on empathy? And so they tried to make the icons look more generic or more personable. And they tried to add elements of storytelling, like putting names behind the figures on the infographic to bring their stories to life. And interestingly enough, none of the design techniques had any impact on viewers' empathy. What actually changed and increased a person's empathy when they looked at the data visual was what the content around it said, and how well that content told personal stories, not just personal stories, impact stories. So how does it impact either the individual or a city or an organization or society at large? And so depending on how they turn the volume up or down on that written content that surrounded the data visual, that was the thing that had the most impact on how someone was able to really walk away with increased emotional intelligence and understanding of that information.
Interesting. What kind of technology do you leverage with this kind of thing? You're seeing New York Times has their own custom visualization software to help tell stories on their software. I mentioned Tableau. There's Power BI. But what kind of technology do you use to enable people to help tell stories at organizations?
That's the blessing of the age that we live in. I mean, we are in an age of vast and robust digital tools. And so you named the major players in data viz, but I think obviously the Adobe Creative Suite and other more manual design tools are still big players. I'll go back really briefly to the pediatric heart failure work that we ended up producing as a result of that training. We started working hand in hand with that client. And now we just launched myactioneducation.org, which is, we essentially helped that client build all of the educational content and animations, illustrations, and infographics to help people understand pediatric heart failure and what treatment options are available to solve it. And so we actually ended up doing quite a bit of animation work inside Illustrator and After Effects. And so that was the modality that felt right to speak to patients and families and children. So I really think it's audience dependent, which tools you want to use. But I think the tools are so robust and vast, but I think the ultimate look and feel of what you create has to be focus solely on who are you trying to reach, how much information and how much depth do they expect, and how much can they really withstand. And for the most part, keeping it simple is never underrated.
I have one question, and then I know Fahad has a bunch of questions at this point, and he's waiting so patiently. So one of the biggest problems with storytelling with data and organizations is access to the data. When you go to tell a story, you might need some sales data or ticketing data, and you might be in operations. And so you might not be able to access that data because of data silos and all of that. How much do you run into that? And what advice would you give to a CIO or CTO that might be listening to reduce these data silos, and so people can tell these stories?
Since the start of 2020, I've actually interviewed about 100 innovation leaders, and that very problem has come up so frequently that our team at Untold actually identified it as a driver of innovation storytelling. And we call it alignment. So where is there misalignment? You mentioned data silos. It's not just data silos, though. It's also the challenge of different parts of the organization having different priorities, different ways of speaking, different, even sometimes different cultural, sort of vibes in those organizations. And so for the innovation team or the development team or the operations team to try to speak to sales or marketing or leadership, you have to be able to align your work with something that's relevant and critical and important to them, or help them see their work in a different way so they can add this as a new priority that they're willing to champion. And the organizations that have a lot of alignment in that way thrive. And the technologists and the creators and the people who can look up from their work and be able to go tell someone who has no idea about it why it matters, and to really, I think it's also some strategies around alignment include active listening, being willing to adapt your story based on the audience, making your storytelling collaborative. So not just telling someone a story, but saying, hey, here's what I'm working on. How can this have relevance to what you're doing and the data that you're collecting? Do you think that we can work together to achieve X goal? Or how can I make this relevant and important to your roadmap and your work? So really functioning inside of your organization, really working toward alignment and working across boundaries is critical. And I think that goes too for external business partnerships, which is critical. And most companies are doing it. Startups are partnering with big co's. Big co's are seeking talent from outside of their organizations. And if you can't find that shared alignment, then it's a real challenge. And I think storytelling can play a really important role in helping you talk not just to your team, but to people outside of it.
Oh, that's fascinating. And it's kind of ironic that to get to the data and, as you mentioned, create that alignment, you need data to tell the story to create the alignment. It's the ironies are lost on me.
I think it's really fascinating too. I think one underlying thought here is that storytelling, there's tremendous ROI to taking this type of approach. And you see companies like Apple, for example, they're great, phenomenal at storytelling, and it definitely started with Steve Jobs, who was just a phenomenal, extraordinary storyteller. And you see that seep through the entire culture of Apple, and this is something that they do. If you're a company that recognizes that as storytelling is something that we may want to consider or we should be doing, we know that it'll impact our business, like what's the best process or approach to maybe not just have it throughout your within your team, but throughout your organization? Like what's the best approach?
I think number one, intentionally collecting and sharing stories, innovation stories, if you can, stories around the technologies that you're creating, what's worked in the past and what hasn't. Failure narratives are just as important as success narratives. And so intentionally adding that to your agenda, that you are going to seek out those stories that build institutional knowledge and that help set a culture and a tone for what you want to be building into the future. So that's number one. Number two, I think most folks aren't trained in how to be effective innovation or data storytellers. And so training your people and making time, carving out just a little bit of time to empower them to essentially stop banging their heads against the wall. What we hear a lot from the people that we train and support through Untold is so many different innovators have shelf after shelf of ideas that have been turned down, that couldn't find a champion, that couldn't get past the innovation team. And part of the challenge is really in the way that that information and that idea is getting presented. And there are many other smart reasons why organizations shelve ideas, but it really shouldn't be. One of the reasons should not be because you didn't tell the story effectively on the impact, the evidence, providing the proper amount of evidence, revealing how it's going to impact customers, impact the company, impact society at large. And then, was it told in an engaging way? Were you able to get a little bit creative, maybe think outside the PowerPoint? Or if you have to think inside the PowerPoint, can you do that with fewer words on the screen? Practicing different creative means of sharing something. And that doesn't have to mean that you're pouring tons of money into creative assets. It could mean really the way in which you tell something. Try telling a personal story from the perspective of a consumer using this new technology. Paint a picture for someone. All of these truths that we know as humans about what makes something memorable in our lives, they can apply even to the most complex scientific topics. And so these are just some strategies, but I think we're going to see far more innovation teams and technologists get trained and empowered to leverage innovation storytelling, to look at epic examples, to use templates at their disposal, and to just really have this as a something to help them from having that feeling of, did that idea, was it really a bad idea, or did I just miss the opportunity to tell it effectively?
Yeah, could you maybe walk us through an example that you went through where, it's like the before, kind of how you're approaching it, what you did to help improve some of the narrative around, the data that you what that was accessible, and then what was the outcome? Like how much did this storytelling, how much did it impact their business?
Sure. Okay. The first example that comes to mind is we are now in a post-Theranos world in Silicon Valley. And if you don't know, Theranos was a disastrous company story, startup story in the medical innovation space. And the reason it was so disastrous is because they didn't validate the model, and Silicon Valley really hadn't, the culture in the tech innovation space is move fast and break things. But when it comes to medical applications, like what Theranos was trying to accomplish, the medical community is the exact opposite, right? Be careful and don't kill people. And so those two cultures sort of, grinding against each other. You can read more about the Theranos story and why it didn't work. But Untold, we support quite a few medical innovation companies in Silicon Valley. And a big part of our role is helping them validate their approach, validate their methods and their, the way that they go about innovating and supporting patients in healthcare contexts, and ensuring that that data is authentic, true, and that it's also told effectively. Theranos in the beginning told a very high impact story that motivated investors, but it didn't actually have the validated medical data that was a true and authentic representation of their technologies. And so it failed disastrously. And so I'll share one success story, perhaps. So one of our clients we've worked with is Crossover Health, which provides on-site and near-site primary care to some of the world's biggest tech companies. And Crossover, one of many medical companies in the Valley now, understanding that we need to be publishing in peer-reviewed journals, and we must have highly published medical experts on our boards. And Crossover knew that from the start and pulled our team of, PhD level medical writers and storytellers in. And so we helped them design and write and publish insights on their methodology, why it works, how it's going to how it does positively impact healthcare. And through that process, we were able to create visualizations, not just data visualizations, but actual visuals that depict the design of the space that they create and why that leads to improved clinical outcomes. And so I think, that's just one example of how industries have to shift and change and sort of grind against each other, if you will. And at the end of the day, evidence and the truth, I hope, prevails.
Yeah, it's interesting you brought up Theranos, and I always cringe when like companies like that, get away with, just fraud, and it's really shameful. And then it's like almost they use storytelling, for for not all the good reasons. It was almost like manipulation in the sense where they were telling this story that just wasn't true, and so they were very good storytellers, but and not in a good way.
Yeah, and that's where spinning the story is never going to be long-term effective if you do it in a way that's not truthful. We sometimes, when we hear the word storytelling, we go back to childhood. And I don't know if you guys had this as kids, but sometimes my parents would say if I was telling a fictional story or if I was like exaggerating the truth, they would say, "Oh, you're telling stories." And that meant you're lying. And so I think we have to break ourselves from this idea that storytelling is the same thing as lying. You can adapt and adjust the story to meet an audience's expectations. But if you're not doing that in a way that is grounded in reality, evidence, data, and truth, I think the world's a worse place because of it. So I think we always have to keep our true north and make sure that we can be accountable to the stories that we're telling.
The only thing that I think I'm blessed for, I think, is that statistics are hard and a lot of people don't understand them. It's so easy to lie with statistics, right? You can hide things in statistics. You can get in there and really do a lot of damage by, and there's countless examples of this, where people they post one number, but then in reality, if you look at the actual number, it's far less or far more than it actually looks. And, when we talk about narrative, there's always dark narratives for whatever thing you look at, right? For example, COVID is a great example. Only 1% of people die that get COVID. Yeah, but 1% of people die when you get COVID, right? Like,
right.
If I said you had a 1% chance of dying every time you got in your car, would you get in your car every day? I don't think you would. I don't think you would. And so on that side, I think people, yes, that's used to downplay it. And it doesn't put it into context, and it doesn't put it into a real story of this is actually really bad compared to normal sicknesses that, if people did a better job explaining the statistic, I mean, that was always used in a negative way. And it's fascinating to me. And like I said, luckily a lot of the bad people don't understand statistics. A lot of people don't understand statistics, which is probably a good thing or maybe a bad thing. I don't know, depending on how you look at it. It's always fascinating. And my favorite is the news graphics, the ones from like second-rate news stations that'll use like a bar chart incorrectly or a pie chart incorrectly to make the numbers look real misleading. I'm not going to point any fingers or name any names. We all know who they are, and we've all seen the infographics pop up on social media of these particular egregious data visualizations.
Yeah, it's the combination of that plus the emotional manipulation of people when that data is getting, quote unquote, data is getting shared in those ways. It is one of the critical challenges of our time is misinformation and disinformation, and the way that alternative facts can get accepted as truths. And there's almost a cultural expectation to be critical, even of people with the highest levels of expertise. And we've seen that just really sadly play out this year in ways I I'm still jaw to the floor, to see so many people not trust science and medicine. And so I really, I think that we have to continue. And this, to me, it points back to how important it is to be able to
Yeah.
share expertise in a way that's relevant, true, but also just relevant and engaging and clear to people at all educational levels from all backgrounds. And I know that's not always the institutional imperative of the company that's trying to, move their needle forward in whatever way. But if we don't do that, society will suffer tremendously. And so, and really all of us, every company um, is at risk of revenue loss and, other punitive things coming from misinformation and disinformation. And so even the small roles that we can play by upholding those standards internally and trying really hard to communicate truth in a way that's still engaging, I just think it can't be understated, because like you said earlier, people's lives are on the line.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think a lot of people miss the fact that there's data, right? We'll call that the facts. There's the information anyone can gather from data, and that's naturally going to be skewed by our biases, right? You can look at one set of data and find an insight, and I can look at the data and find a completely different insight because we both have different backgrounds and everything. And that doesn't make either of us wrong. That's just our viewpoint. And I think people find that and they say, well, that you can't possibly be telling the truth. You didn't get the same insight as me. So it's like, no, this is a different insight. It's a different way of looking at the same set of data to find a different insight in the same data. And the fact that people miss that, I think that's what caused a lot of the mistrust. Well, I looked at it and it said this. Well, okay, maybe that's not a lie, right? And you looked at it and said that, and maybe that's not a lie either. I think that, of course, you can take it and make something up about the data. Well, then, yeah, it's a lie. But if you look at it and you find a legitimate insight, you can find enriched data. Like, for example, the pandemic we're in now has more data than any pandemic we've ever had in history, just because we're tracking it more. So naturally, more things about this particular pandemic are going to be known than, say, the Spanish flu, right? And that's okay. And so naturally, there are going to be more people with more opinions because there's more data and more insight. I think it's information overload for a lot of people. And it's going back to the storytelling aspect of the podcast. The storytelling here is, how can I synthesize the massive amounts of data today that we all have access to, right? The 24-hour news, the thousands of online news sources, the social media takes, the actual data that we can get access to, and synthesize it to a story that people find credible, honest, and can understand fully. I think it's becoming more and more of an art form, and one that we haven't even come close to mastering yet as the entrepreneurs, as professionals, and as a society as well.
And we have to, because meanwhile, while we're struggling as experts to translate that knowledge for lay audiences, those who want to spread rapid disinformation quickly for whatever purposes they have, they're doing it fast and they're getting ahead of us. And then we're left in a place of being reactive instead of proactive. And that's why clinicians and scientists and experts in all fields got to start getting comfortable with trying to explain their research and their insights and their data to their dads or their moms or their children, right? That's one place to start, at least. And it's so hard to do. But if we don't start getting in that habit, we're always going to be in a reactive position instead of the one saying, here's the truth, and that's coming first.
Following up on tech, when I look at tech, I can't believe how many engineers, how many people write off the layman and say, well, they're not going to understand AI. They're not going to understand computer vision. They're not going to understand blockchain. So we shouldn't make them understand it, right? And that is such a disservice to society, because everyone's like, I can't believe people still use Facebook. Well, if they knew what you and I know, they wouldn't. but they don't understand it like me and you understand it. If I'm talking to somebody that knows exactly how pervasive and dark Facebook's data use is. And so in that vein, we're doing society a disservice by giving up on the layman and not trying to explain these frankly incredible innovations we've created in software. Instead, we're just writing them off and saying, well, they're never going to understand it, so we'll just keep implementing it, and hopefully one day they do. And it's gonna, I think, gonna get far worse with regulations and assaults on the tech industry as governments try to rein this in and say, no, you can't just carte blanche do whatever you want because no one understands what you're doing. We're just going to regulate you. And then the worst part about that is they're going to regulate you in ignorance, and they may destroy you completely, right? And they don't know. They're just lobbing missiles at that point at hopefully the targets that matter. And you can see it in some of the regulations being passed that they don't quite understand what they're even going after, but they have to do something, and they know that.
Yeah, it's important. I think storytelling will definitely help that. So, okay, Katie, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit here. The real reason we do this podcast is to get free consulting advice. So, Skipless mission is, to build thoughtful software and change the world through thoughtful software. And the main reason is that 68% of software projects fail, right? It's abysmal statistic, and we wanted to change that. What would you recommend to us how we can convey this story? And, this is the real reason why we founded Skipless. What would be some tips that you could give us? And should we start with the statistic? Should we start with our mission? How do you think we should approach that?
I think you should start with your user and the people you're impacting, or the organizations you're impacting. Start there. Start with impact and outcome, and work backwards and say, how do we get this client to that point? How do we help this customer achieve that goal? Pull that story, practice saying it in 2 minutes or less. I just made up that number, talking of data storytelling. And then practice saying it in 30 seconds or less. And then start building and identifying internally as you together start sharing those stories. Start to build a larger strategy behind collecting those stories, building them out into larger case narratives. Empower others on your team. Make sure that knowledge is transferring to new people on your team, so that you're all speaking a shared language internally, but also to potential customers and potential business partners. That's a great step in the right direction. Whether to use a statistic or a story is a great question as well. And I am a big advocate of get some different options on the page and utilize them at different moments and see how people react. I think the most critical tool that we can use when we're doing innovation and data storytelling is iteration and feedback, just like anything else, just in the same way that you're designing thoughtful software. That's based on feedback, iteration, and building over time. And so it's the same with storytelling. It doesn't have to be perfect from the start. Share a shitty first draft, get a reaction, and refine it. Don't be afraid.
Oh, I love it. I was furiously taking notes as you're saying that. So we'll definitely try to incorporate some of that. And as a final thought, I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I'm sure Andrew has as well. Beyond companies using your services to help with storytelling, what's some advice that you could recommend to technology leaders or anyone in general to improve their storytelling and just become more comfortable with this with the process?
Well, I think that training does make a difference. If you can pour just a little bit of time into your professional development for your people or yourself as a leader, it can go a really long way, especially if you don't have the preference or budget to have one-on-one consulting or support from a firm like ours. At least you can make a little bit of time for us to share with you what we know and what we've uncovered through our interviews and our research and our work with industry and government, and be able to use that moving forward. So I think making time to learn. One thing we do at Untold is we're constantly gathering what we call epic examples of effective innovation and data storytelling. So you can start doing that too. And I would love for you to ping us on social media or via email. When you find epic examples and you want to share them with us, we will amplify them as well to our audiences. But looking for epic examples, just like all the great writers of all time, repeat what worked in the past and think creatively about new ways. And don't be too afraid of it, again, being too perfect. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much, Katie.
Thank you both. This has been a really, really exciting conversation. I'm thrilled. I'm hopeful that you're going to join me over on the Untold Stories of Innovation podcast. And so we'll be able to just talk more about these topics, and I can put you in the hot seat next time.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. I would love to do that.
It'll be really fun.
Let's do it.
Thanks for listening. You can always connect with us at skiplist.com.